in a cave whose location we cannot determine with certainty, in a time we can only approximately date to perhaps 400,000 years ago or perhaps earlier, in darkness that had been absolute since the cave formed, something changed. A hand reached toward fire, not fled from it as every animal instinct demanded, not simply scavenged the remains of natural fire caused by lightning or by volcanic activity, but reached toward the flame intentionally, took burning branch from wildfire and carried it back to shelter, kept it alive through the night, fed it with dry wood, protected it from rain and wind, transformed fire from natural force that happened to humans into tool that humans controlled. The moment was threshold between the world as it had always been and the world as it would become, was transformation as profound as any in human history, was the carrying of starlight down to earth, the claiming of power that belonged to lightning and to sun, the first domestication not of plants or animals, but of elemental force itself. The evidence for controlled fire use is difficult to interpret. The traces are subtle burned bones and charcoal deposits and stones heated to temperatures higher than natural fires typically reach. The oldest convincing evidence comes from sites that are several 100,000 years old, though some researchers argue for much earlier dates based on contested findings. But whenever the threshold was crossed, the consequences were enormous. Fire changed everything. Changed what humans could eat. Cooked food is more digestible, unlocks nutrients that raw food keeps locked, makes tough plants and meats accessible to jaws and digestive systems that evolved for different diets. The additional calories from cooked food may have enabled the brain expansion that makes us human. The large human brain requires enormous energy, approximately 20% of the body's caloric intake, despite being only 2% of body weight. The brain could grow large only when diet could support it. Cooked food provided the calories that fueled the expansion. But fire changed more than nutrition, changed the daily rhythm of life. Before fire, humans were creatures of daylight. When sun set, activity largely ceased. Darkness meant vulnerability, meant inability to see predators, meant cold in temperate climates, meant the day was over and there was nothing to do but sleep. Fire extended the day, created circle of light and warmth where humans could gather after sunset, could continue working on tools and hides and implements, could socialize, could tell stories. The gathering around fire may have been crucial for language development. The time spent in firelight, the close proximity that fire enabled in otherwise dark and cold nights, The extended interaction between individuals all created conditions where language could develop, where the sounds that primates had always made could evolve into words, where communication could become more complex because there was time and space and reason for complexity. The hearth became the center. The fire was the place where the group gathered, was the marker of home in ways that no other feature could be. A cave or shelter without fire was just a cave. The same space with fire burning became home, became the place to return to, became the center around which life organized itself. The hearth was where food was cooked, where tools were made, where stories were told, where knowledge was transmitted from the old to the young, where the group became more than just individuals sharing space and became community bound by the shared fire. The importance of hearth would persist through all of human history, through the millennia, when humans lived as foragers gathered around campfires, through the agricultural revolution when hearths became features of permanent homes, through industrialization when hearths became fireplaces, and then became symbolic rather than functional. The gathering around fire is human behavior that reaches back hundreds of thousands of years. But fire was dangerous, required constant attention. Left unattended, fire could spread, could destroy the shelter it was meant to illuminate, could kill those it was meant to serve. The fire could go out, the embers could die, leaving the group in darkness and cold until fire could be rekindled or new fire could be stolen from natural sources. The making of fire, the deliberate creation of flame through friction, or through striking stones to create sparks, may have come much later than the keeping of fire. The evidence suggests that for perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, humans could maintain fire but could not reliably create it, had to carry embers when traveling, had to protect the fire carefully, had to ensure it never went out because rekindling was difficult or impossible. The dependence on fire meant vulnerability. Groups that lost their fire were disadvantaged, were cold, and were limited to raw food, and were without the protection that fire offered against predators who feared flame. The uses of fire multiplied over time. Fire could be used to harden wooden spear points, to make them more effective weapons. Fire could be used to crack stones, to make them easier to shape into tools. Fire could be used to clear land, to drive game toward hunters, to manage landscapes in ways that increased the availability of food plants. Fire could be used to send signals, smoke during day, flame at night that could communicate across distances. Fire could be used socially. The offering of fire from one group to another could be gesture of alliance, while the refusal to share fire could be act of hostility. Fire could be used ritually, flames and smoke rising toward sky, transforming material into immaterial, connecting earth to heaven in ways that suggested the sacred. The psychological impact of fire was equally profound. Humans sitting in firelight watching flames dance, watching shadows move, experiencing the hypnotic flicker that draws the eye and seems to contain movement and meaning. This created mental state that was conducive to reflection, to storytelling, to the development of religious feeling. The fire was alive in ways that other tools were not. It moved. It consumed. It required feeding. It could die. The fire was almost like a being, almost like something that had to be cared for, that responded to care or neglect. The relationship between humans and fire was not simply utilitarian, was not just using a tool, was partnership, was dependence, was transformation of both parties. Fire changed humans, but humans also changed fire, selected it, bred it through choosing which woods burned best, domesticated it in ways parallel to the later domestication of plants and animals. In the cave's darkness, in the circle of firelight that pushed back the night, the first humans who kept fire alive through darkness were crossing threshold, were becoming something new. We're taking the first step toward civilization that would eventually build cities and empires and technologies that would seem like magic to those who first carried flame from wildfire to cave. But the first firekeepers could not have known this, could not have imagined cities or agriculture or writing, could only know that the fire was warm, that it made the darkness less threatening, that it allowed them to see each other's faces after sunset, that it cooked the meat and made it good. The fire in the cave, the flame kept alive through night, the first domestication. Forever the threshold crossed, forever the fire that knew its own light, forever the burning that transformed us from creatures who feared flame to beings who carried it, who fed it, who made it ours. The fire, the light, the transformation, forever. Long before the mind had language to express the thought, I am making a tool. Before consciousness could reflect upon itself and understand, I am planning for tomorrow. Before the brain had expanded to anything approaching modern human size, the hands knew. The fingers knew how stone felt when it was the right kind of stone, when it had the grain that would fracture cleanly rather than crumble uselessly. The palm knew the weight that meant the stone was dense enough to work, but not so dense it would resist shaping. The wrist knew the angle of strike that would detach a flake rather than shatter the core. The shoulder knew the force required, not too gentle or nothing would break, not too hard or everything would break. The knowledge was in the body, was held not in words or in conscious thought, but in the neuromuscular patterns that developed through practice, through watching others, through trial and error repeated thousands of times, until the hands simply knew what to do without the mind needing to direct them consciously. The oldest stone tools we have found are approximately 2.6 million years old, were discovered at Gona in Ethiopia, are simple flakes struck from core's sharp edges created by breaking stone rather than by grinding or polishing. The simplicity is deceptive. Making even these basic tools requires understanding of how stone fractures, requires selecting appropriate materials, requires motor skills that our closest primate relatives do not possess. The tools were made by ancestors whose brains were much smaller than ours, perhaps 450 cubic centimeters, compared to modern human average of 1,350 cubic centimeters. The beings who made these tools were not human in the modern sense, were species called Australopithecus or early Homo, depending on which fossils are associated with which tools, were upright walking primates who still retained many ape-like features, but they could make tools, could shape stone to create edges that did not exist in nature, could plan ahead enough to carry tools with them, or to remember where good stone sources were located so they could return to make tools when needed. The knowledge of stoneworking was transmitted across generations, was taught from old to young, but the teaching could not have been verbal instruction of the sort we use. Hold the stone like this, strike at this angle, use this amount of force. The ancestors who made the oldest tools probably had limited language or no language at all. The teaching was through observation and imitation. The young watched the old working stone, tried to copy what they saw, failed repeatedly, gradually learned through practice what angles worked and what didn't, what stone types were suitable and what weren't, what techniques produced good tools and what techniques produced only broken rock. The learning took time. Modern experiments in teaching stone toolmaking show that even with verbal instruction, developing real skill requires years of practice. For ancestors without language, the learning must have taken even longer, but the knowledge persisted, was passed down through generations for millions of years. The technology of stone toolmaking is the oldest technology we know, is the first evidence of culture in the sense of learned behaviors transmitted across generations. The tools evolved slowly over hundreds of thousands of years. The earliest simple flakes gave way to more sophisticated implements. The hand axe appeared approximately 1.7 million years ago, was teardrop-shaped tool, worked on both sides to create sharp edge all around the perimeter, symmetrical and elegant in ways that suggest aesthetic sense as well as functional design. The hand axes were made for hundreds of thousands of years, with remarkably little variation, informed the design that emerged early persisted because it worked, because it was effective for cutting meat and scraping hides and processing plant materials. The conservatism of stone tool technology is striking to modern sensibilities accustomed to rapid change. But for ancestors whose lives were short and whose survival depended on reliable tools, innovation for its own sake was not valuable. What mattered was having tools that worked. The hand axe worked, was passed down through countless generations, each generation learning from previous generation to make the tool in the same way, in the way that had proven effective. The stone tools reveal much about those who made them, reveal that they could plan. The process of making a hand axe requires envisioning the finished tool and working toward that vision through multiple steps. Reveal that they had handedness. Analysis of stone tools shows that most were made by right-handed individuals, suggesting that the lateralization of brain function that makes most modern humans right-handed was already present millions of years ago. Reveal that they could recognize good and bad raw materials. Stone tools are often found far from the sources of stone they were made from, suggesting that toolmakers traveled to good stone sources, or that they transported stone across landscapes. Reveal that they had teaching traditions. The consistency of hand axe design across time and space suggests that there was right way and wrong way to make the tool, that the knowledge was not simply individual but was cultural. But the tools also reveal what the makers could not do, could not create the sophisticated compound tools that later humans would make. The spears with separate points hafted onto shafts, the arrows with carefully shaped tips, the knives with handles, could not make tools that required planning multiple steps ahead, could not create the diversity of specialized implements that archaeological sites from later periods contain. The tools are elegant in their simplicity, but the simplicity reflects the limits of the minds that made them. The hands knew stone, but the minds did not yet have the capacity for complex innovation, for creativity that went beyond tradition, for the explosion of technological diversity that would come later with larger brains and with language. The relationship between stoneworking and brain evolution is complex. Did toolmaking drive brain expansion by creating selective pressure that favored individuals with better motor control, with better ability to plan, with better ability to teach and learn? Or did brain expansion occur for other reasons, and then enable more sophisticated tool-making? The question may have no simple answer. The relationship was likely feedback loop. Better brains enabled better tools. Better tools provided benefits that selected for even better brains. The cycle repeated over millions of years until brains had tripled in size and tools had gone from simple flakes to the elaborate technologies that modern humans employ. In the hands holding stone, in the striking of one rock against another to create an edge, in the repetition across millions of years of this fundamental human activity, there is continuity that connects us to ancestors who barely resembled us. The hands that knew stone were attached to beings whose minds were different from ours, whose capacity for language was limited or absent, whose self-awareness may have been rudimentary. But they could make tools, could shape the world rather than simply accepting it as they found it, could create what did not exist in nature. The hands that remembered stone, the knowledge in fingers and wrist and shoulder, the tools made before language could name them, forever the first technology, forever the shaping of stone that began the shaping of the world, forever the hands that knew before the mind could explain what they knew, the hands, the stone, the knowledge, forever. At Litali in Tanzania, in volcanic ash that fell 3.66 million years ago, in a moment that was preserved with impossible clarity, 3 individuals walked. 2 adults and a child walked across the ash while it was still wet enough to hold impressions, but dry enough not to stick to their feet. Walked in a line with the child, stepping in the footprints left by the larger individual ahead. Walked perhaps 70 steps before the trackway ends, before erosion, or before they simply walked beyond the area that was covered by ash. And then the trackway was buried, was covered by other deposits, was preserved underground for millions of years, until discovery in the 1970s revealed these footprints frozen in time, these traces of ancestors walking in posture that is fully upright, in stride that is recognizably human, walking toward a future they could not imagine, carrying in their bodies and their behaviors the beginnings of what would eventually become us. The footprints are testimony to upright walking. The heel strikes first. The weight rolls forward across the foot. The big toe pushes off. The gait is distinctive, is the same basic pattern that we use when we walk. The bipedal locomotion that these footprints demonstrate was already fully developed 3.66 million years ago, was not tentative, was not awkward, was accomplished and efficient. The ancestors who left these prints had been walking upright for long enough that the gait was refined, that the skeletal adaptations that make bipedalism possible were complete. The footprints push back the date for habitual upright walking significantly earlier than many fossils had suggested, prove that our ancestors were walking on two legs millions of years before their brains expanded to modern size, millions of years before they developed sophisticated tool-making, millions of years before language emerged. Walking upright came first, was the fundamental adaptation that made everything else possible. The transition from four-legged to two-legged locomotion was enormous transformation, required wholesale restructuring of the skeleton. The spine changed from horizontal to vertical orientation, developed curves that helped balance the body over the pelvis. The pelvis changed shape, dramatically became shorter and broader to support the abdominal organs in vertical posture, changed the attachment points for muscles that maintain balance and that enable bipedal walking. The legs straightened and lengthened. The foot developed arch that acts as spring during walking. The big toe aligned with the other toes rather than remaining opposable as it is in apes. The foramen magnum, the hole through which spinal cord enters the skull, moved to the bottom of the skull rather than the back, positioning the head atop the spine in balance, rather than requiring constant muscular effort to hold head up as quadrupeds do. The changes brought costs as well as benefits. The human spine is not ideally designed for vertical posture. Back pain is nearly universal human complaint, is consequence of asking structure that evolved for horizontal orientation to maintain vertical position. The human pelvis creates problems for childbirth. The birth canal is narrow because pelvis had to change shape to support upright posture. But human infants have large heads because of our big brains. The combination means that human birth is difficult and dangerous compared to birth in other primates. Human infants are born more helpless than the young of our closest relatives are born before development is complete because, if they developed further, their heads would be too large to pass through birth canal. The helplessness of human infants requires extended parental care, creates dependency that lasts years rather than months. But the benefits of upright walking were substantial enough to outweigh the costs. The hands were freed from locomotion, could carry things, food, infants, tools, could be used more extensively for manipulation, for the making and using of tools that would eventually become central to human adaptation. The upright posture meant seeing farther over tall grass of the savanna where our ancestors lived, could spot predators earlier, could see distant herds of animals that might be hunted, could navigate more effectively by being able to see landmarks from greater distance. The upright posture reduced sun exposure body presented less surface area to the overhead sun, meaning less heat absorption in the hot African environment where our ancestors evolved. The upright posture may have enabled efficient long-distance walking and running that allowed our ancestors to pursue game animals until the animals collapsed from exhaustion, a hunting technique that some human groups still practice. The footprints at Litali tell other stories beyond demonstrating bipedalism. Tell us about social relationships. The three individuals walking together suggests some form of social bond, suggests that they traveled as group rather than as isolated individuals. The size difference between the two adults suggests they were male and female, though this interpretation is debated. The child following in the larger footprints suggests learned behavior, suggests perhaps teaching, suggests parent and child or at least adult and juvenile traveling together. The footprints were going in specific direction. We're not wandering aimlessly. We're heading somewhere with apparent purpose. The individuals who left these prints were beings with lives, with relationships, with intentions that directed their movements. But the beings who walked were not human in the modern sense. Were Australopithecus a forensis species known from many fossils, most famously Lucy, the partial skeleton discovered in 1974. The species had brains approximately one-third the size of modern humans, had faces that still retained many ape-like features, had arms that were relatively long compared to modern humans, suggesting they still spent significant time in trees despite being fully bipedal on the ground. The species made no tools as far as we know. The oldest stone tools appear more than 500,000 years after Litali footprints. The species almost certainly had no language in the modern sense. Were creatures that were on the path to becoming human but were not yet human. Yet they walked as we walk, walked across the African landscape in posture and gait that we would recognize as our own. The footprints walking across the ash capture a moment. Three individuals whose names we will never know, whose languages, if they had language, we cannot reconstruct, whose thoughts we cannot access, walking toward a future that would eventually include us. Walking away from the past that was arboreal life, walking toward the future that would be terrestrial existence, carrying in their upright bodies the adaptation that would enable everything that followed. The footprints walking out of Eden, walking out of the African origins, walking toward the global dispersal that humans would eventually achieve, walking toward the future with no knowledge that they were carrying that future in their altered skeletons and their upright posture, the footprints in the ash, the stride that was already ours, the walking that made us human before anything else made us human. Forever the three who walked together, forever the footprints preserved, forever the testimony in ash that our ancestors walked upright while their minds were still small, walked into becoming while still being what they had been. The footprints, the walking, the journey that continues still, forever. In the deep past before history, before stories were written on clay or carved in stone, before even the oldest myths were first told around fires, there was a moment when a voice first produced sounds that referred to something not immediately present. When a sequence of sounds connected to concept rather than to thing, to idea rather than to object, to past or future rather than only to present. When communication became symbolic rather than merely reactive. When a sound meant tomorrow or danger or gathering place, rather than being simply alarm call or mating call or territorial declaration. The threshold between animal communication and human language is impossible to locate precisely. Was not single moment, but was process extending over hundreds of thousands of years. But whenever and however it occurred, the emergence of language was transformation as profound as upright walking or fire. Was the creation of entirely new kind of cognition, new way of thinking that was possible only through the medium of words. All animals communicate, make sounds that convey meaning, the alarm calls that warn of predators, the mating calls that attract partners, the territorial calls that warn rivals away. Some primates have relatively complex vocal repertoires with different calls for different types of danger, different calls for different social contexts. But animal communication is fundamentally tied to immediate context, is reactive rather than creative, is limited to conveying information about present circumstances or about internal states like hunger or fear or aggression. Animal communication cannot easily refer to past or future, cannot easily convey abstract concepts, cannot create new meanings by combining elements in novel ways. Human language is different. Is symbolic words are arbitrary sounds connected to meanings by convention rather than by natural relationship. Is generative finite set of words and grammatical rules can produce infinite number of sentences expressing infinite number of meanings. Is displaced can refer to things that are absent in time or space, can discuss yesterday and tomorrow and places far away, can describe imaginary situations that have never existed. Language is what makes human thought human. The physical capacity for speech required anatomical changes. The larynx, the voice box, had to descend in the throat to create larger resonating chamber that allows the range of sounds human speech requires. The descended larynx creates vulnerability, increases risk of choking because air passage and food passage cross, but the benefits of speech apparently outweighed the costs. The tongue had to become more mobile, more capable of rapid movements required for articulating different sounds. The breath control had to become more refined. Speech requires ability to control exhalation precisely, to produce steady stream of air that can be modulated into different sounds. The brain structures had to develop that specialized for language processing. Broca's area for speech production, Wernicke's area for language comprehension, the connections between them, and to other brain regions that integrate language with thought and memory and planning. The genetic evidence provides some clues. The FOXP2 gene, which is involved in speech production, differs between humans and other primates. People with mutations in FOXP2 have severe speech and language impairments. The gene appears to have been under selection in human evolution. The modern human version differs from the chimpanzee version in ways that suggest adaptive changes. When researchers introduced human FOXP2 into mice, the mice showed changes in vocalization. The gene does not cause language. Language is far too complex to be controlled by single gene. But FOXP2 is part of the genetic foundation that makes speech possible. The modern human version may have become fixed in the population relatively recently in evolutionary terms, perhaps within the last 200,000 years, though dating is uncertain and controversial. Neanderthals had the same FOXP2 variant that modern humans have, had descended larynx similar to modern humans, had hyoid bone which supports the tongue shaped like modern human hyoid. The anatomical evidence suggests Neanderthals could produce the sounds of human speech. Whether they had language in the full modern sense with complex grammar, with large vocabulary, with displaced reference and generativity is unanswerable question. They left no written records. No recordings of their voices exist. The archaeological evidence shows they were sophisticated, made complex tools, used fire, buried their dead, created some forms of art. But whether sophistication required full language or whether limited language was sufficient is debated. The question matters for understanding whether language is universal human trait or is specific to modern humans, whether language is old shared with Neanderthals, and therefore dating back at least 500,000 years to common ancestor? Or is recent innovation perhaps only 100,000 or 200,000 years old? The first words would have been concrete names for things that were immediately useful, words for water and food and danger and child. But language grew, added words for actions, for relationships, for qualities, for abstract concepts, developed grammar that allowed combining words into sentences that expressed relationships between things, that conveyed who did what to whom, that could describe sequences of events, that could express causation and comparison and condition. Language enabled planning that extended beyond immediate future, enabled teaching that went beyond simple imitation, enabled accumulation of knowledge across generations. The old could tell the young what they had learned, could pass down wisdom verbally, could create cultural transmission of information that did not require each generation to learn everything anew through experience. Language enabled stories, enabled the human ability to create narratives, to impose structure on experience, to remember events as connected sequences rather than as isolated moments. The stories served multiple functions: entertained, educated, bonded groups together through shared narratives, preserved cultural knowledge and values, explained natural phenomena and human nature. The myths and legends that later societies would write down likely had origins in oral storytelling traditions that extended back to the emergence of language. The stories were not simple entertainment, were technologies for preserving and transmitting knowledge in preliterate societies, were mnemonic devices that made information memorable through narrative structure and emotional engagement, were the first literature, composed and performed without writing, passed down through generations through memorization and retelling. But language also enabled lying, enabled deception that went beyond simple behavioral trickery that some animals can perform, enabled saying things that were not true, creating false narratives, manipulating others through words. The capacity for linguistic deception may have created selective pressure for social intelligence, for ability to detect deception, for the mental arms race that drove increasing cognitive sophistication. The complex social dynamics of human groups may have been both cause and consequence of language. Large social groups required communication to maintain relationships, but language enabled even larger groups by making coordination and cooperation possible on unprecedented scale. The voice that first said tomorrow was speaking word that did not exist in present moment, was referring to time that had not yet arrived, was demonstrating displaced reference that is fundamental to human language, was showing that minds could think about the not-etrial, could plan for future, could imagine, and could share those imaginings through words. The threshold crossed was cognitive as much as linguistic, was the emergence of thought that could transcend immediate present, that could remember past and anticipate future, that could conceive of possibilities and alternatives. Language made us time travelers in sense not physically traveling through time, but mentally inhabiting past and future through memory and planning and imagination. The voice saying tomorrow, the word carrying meaning beyond the moment, the threshold between animal communication and human language, forever the first symbolic speech, forever the words that created new kind of thinking, forever the language that made us human, the voice, the words, tomorrow, forever. Deep in caves in France and Spain and Indonesia and elsewhere, in chambers that require crawling through passages so narrow that claustrophobia threatens, in darkness so complete that no natural light has reached these depths, since the caves formed there are paintings, handprints outlined in red ochre or in black charcoal, the hand pressed against stone wall and pigment blown around it, creating negative image that preserves the shape of fingers splayed against the rock. Animals rendered with such skill that we can recognize species, can see the musculature, can perceive the movement that the artists captured. Horses galloping, bison standing, deer leaping, lions hunting. The paintings are not simple daubs, are sophisticated art created by people who understood perspective, who captured motion, who observed their subjects carefully enough to render anatomical details accurately. And the paintings are old some 40,000 years, some perhaps older, dating to the earliest period of modern human presence in Europe. The caves were not living spaces, were not the places where people made their homes. The evidence is clear: no hearths for cooking, no accumulation of domestic debris, no signs of daily occupation. The caves were special places, were entered deliberately, probably rarely, certainly not casually. The journey into the caves was itself significant, required light, required careful navigation through passages, required overcoming natural fear of enclosed spaces and darkness. The caves were thresholds, were liminal places between the surface world of daily life and some other realm, some space that was set apart, that was sacred or ceremonial or magical, or however these concepts would have been understood by people who had no writing and who left no text to explain themselves. The act of entering the caves, of descending into darkness carrying torch or stone lamp filled with animal fat, of crawling through passages until reaching the chambers where paintings would be made. This was journey with meaning, was transition that marked the painting as special. The pigments were prepared with care. Ochre iron oxide ranging from yellow to red to brown, depending on mineral content and heat treatment, was ground to powder, was mixed with water or with fat or with blood to create paste that could be applied to stone. Charcoal was used for black, created by carefully burning wood or bones. Manganese dioxide provided darker black or purple. The preparation required knowledge, knowing which minerals to collect, knowing how to process them, knowing what binders worked. Required tools, stones for grinding pigments, containers for mixing, applicators for applying paint to walls. Required planning, gathering materials before entering cave, bringing everything needed because returning to surface to retrieve forgotten items would require repeating the difficult journey. The techniques varied. Some paintings were made with fingers, spreading pigment directly on stone. Some were made with brushes, bundles of plant fibers or animal hair that could hold pigment and could create fine lines. Some were made by blowing pigment onto wall, filling mouth with pigment mixed with saliva, and blowing it through pursed lips or through hollow bone onto the surface. The blowpainting technique was particularly used for hand outlines, hand pressed against wall, pigment blown around it, hand removed to reveal negative image. The handprints are poignant, are the most direct connection we have to the people who made them. When we look at handprint in cave, we are seeing the exact shape of someone's hand, seeing the size that tells us whether it was adult or child, man or woman, seeing the fingers spread just as they were spread 40,000 years ago. The handprints are signatures, are statements of presence, are declarations, I was here. The meanings of the cave paintings are lost. We can speculate, and scholars have speculated extensively, but we cannot know with certainty why the paintings were made. Were they hunting magic? Representations of animals intended to ensure successful hunts through sympathetic magic that believed depicting the animal gave power over it? Were they ceremonial images used in initiation rites, with young people brought into caves to experience darkness and paintings as part of becoming adults? Were they cosmological maps, representations of spirit world, or of mythological narratives we can no longer reconstruct? Were they artistic expressions driven by human need to create beauty, to represent experience, to leave mark on the world? The explanations are not mutually exclusive. The caves may have served multiple purposes. Different caves may have been used differently. The images may have accumulated meaning over time, may have been understood differently by different generations who repainted them or added to them over thousands of years. The animals depicted are interesting for what they include and exclude. The paintings show many horses, many bison, many deer animals that were hunted, animals that were important to survival, animals that were observed closely. But the paintings also show dangerous animals that were not hunted: lions and bears and mammoths. The paintings rarely show the animals that were most commonly eaten according to bone evidence from habitation sites. We're not simply depicting daily diet. We're selecting particular animals for reasons we cannot fully determine. The paintings almost never show plants or landscape features. Focus on animals almost exclusively. The human figures are rare and are often stylized or abstracted. When humans appear, they are less realistic than the animals. The animals were rendered with care and skill that the human representations usually lack. The distribution of paintings within caves is not random. Paintings cluster in certain chambers, appear where acoustic properties create echoes or reverberations, appear where natural features of rock suggest animal forms that paintings elaborate. The placement suggests intentionality, suggests that the painters were responding to the caves themselves, were choosing locations based on properties of the space, were integrating paintings with the cave environment rather than simply using caves as blank surfaces to paint on. The chambers with paintings often require difficult access, are not the easiest chambers to reach, are often deep within cave systems, are sometimes in locations that required climbing or squeezing through tight spaces. The difficulty of access may have been part of the point, may have made the paintings more powerful, more sacred, more significant precisely because reaching them was challenging. The paintings exist in darkness, were created in darkness, are seen in darkness unless we bring lights. The painters worked by flickering torchlight or by light from stone lamps. The animals they painted would have appeared to move as the light moved, would have seemed animated by the dancing flames. The experience of seeing the paintings in firelight would have been fundamentally different from seeing them under modern electric lights, would have been more mysterious, more emotional, more overwhelming. The darkness surrounding the small circle of light, the sounds of breathing and of dripping water echoing in the chambers, the smell of smoke and of damp stone, the cold seeping from rock into bones, all would have contributed to the experience. All would have made the encounter with the images powerful in ways that we can barely imagine. The cave paintings are humanity's oldest surviving art, are evidence that aesthetic sense, that need to create beauty, that impulse to make images is ancient, reaches back to the earliest modern humans, is fundamental to what we are. The paintings testify that 40,000 years ago, humans had minds like ours, had capacity for symbolic thought, had artistic vision, had cultural traditions that valued creation of images, had relationships to animals and to landscape that motivated investing enormous effort in creating these paintings. The pigments ground from earth, the images created in darkness, the art that survives in caves that hold it, forever the painting speaking across millennia, forever the hands outlined on stone, forever the animals running on walls, forever the art testifying that we have always created, have always sought to represent experience, have always needed to make marks that declare we were here. The cave paintings, the ancient art, the testimony to human creativity, forever. At Kafze Cave in Israel, archaeologists discovered graves nearly 100,000 years old. The burials were deliberate bodies positioned carefully, sometimes in fetal position, sometimes laid out straight. With the dead were grave goods, red ochre sprinkled on the bodies, shells that had been collected from the Mediterranean 20 miles away, deliberately placed with the deceased. At Eskal Cave nearby, similar burials from similar time period. These are among the oldest known deliberate burials, are evidence that humans understood death not merely as cessation of life, but as transition requiring ritual, requiring care, requiring investment of time and resources, and emotion that pragmatic disposal of corpses would not demand. The graves demonstrate consciousness of mortality, demonstrate capacity for grief, demonstrate perhaps belief in something beyond death that made proper burial important. The dead could simply have been left. Bodies decompose. Scavengers consume flesh. Bones scatter. The pragmatic approach that many animals follow is simply to leave the dead where they fall. But humans from at least 100,000 years ago and possibly earlier chose to bury their dead, chose to dig graves, to place bodies in them, to cover them with earth. The labor was significant. Digging graves with simple stone tools is difficult work, requires hours of effort, requires overcoming reluctance to handle corpses, requires social coordination. Someone must do the digging, someone must prepare the body. The group must agree that burial is appropriate response to death. That humans chose this difficult path suggests that burial mattered deeply, was not optional cultural practice, but was something felt as necessary, as required, as proper way to treat the dead. The red ochre is particularly interesting. Ochre appears repeatedly in early burials. Was valuable had to be obtained from specific sources, had to be processed into powder, had to be brought to burial site, was deliberately applied to bodies or placed with them. The meaning of ochre is uncertain. The color may have been significant red like blood, red like life, perhaps symbolizing continuation of life force or protection in death. Ochre may have had practical function, masks the smell of decomposition, has antimicrobial properties that slow decay. But the use seems too consistent, too deliberate, too widespread to be merely practical. The ochre was statement, was marking of the dead as special, was investment of value in burial that suggests belief that the dead remained important even after death, that they deserved attention and respect and perhaps assistance in whatever journey they were undertaking. The shells found in graves are even more clearly symbolic. Shells have no practical function for the dead. Were not food, the shells in graves are ornamental species, not edible species. Were not tools. Were valuable as ornaments, as marks of status perhaps, as beautiful objects. That they were buried with the dead suggests belief that the dead would need or would benefit from having these objects. Suggests perhaps belief in afterlife where the deceased would continue to exist and where possessions from life might be useful or comforting. Or suggests that burying valuable objects was appropriate way to honor the dead, was sacrifice that demonstrated the living's grief and respect. The shells had to be obtained from the coast, had to be transported inland to the burial sites. The effort involved in obtaining and transporting shells made them valuable. That they were buried rather than kept or reused makes clear that burial was considered important enough to justify the sacrifice. The position of bodies varies across burials but shows consistency within cultural groups. Some burials place body in fetal position, knees drawn up to chest, hands sometimes near face. The position may have symbolic meaning, returning to position of birth, perhaps symbolizing rebirth or return to womb of earth. Some burials place body extended, laid out straight. The position may represent sleep, may be an attempt to make the dead appear peaceful. The consistency within groups suggests that positioning was not random, but followed cultural norms, followed beliefs about proper way to treat the dead. The variation between groups suggests that different communities had different traditions, different understandings of death, different beliefs about what death meant and what the dead required. The question of whether Neanderthals buried their dead is contentious. There are some Neanderthal skeletons that appear to have been deliberately buried bodies in what seem to be graves, sometimes apparently covered with stones, sometimes in positions suggesting deliberate placement. But skeptics argue that the evidence is ambiguous, that natural processes could explain many supposed Neanderthal burials, that there is little clear evidence of grave goods or of ritual behavior accompanying Neanderthal burials. If Neanderthals did bury their dead, the practice appears less elaborate and less consistent than human burial practices. The difference, if real, might suggest that Neanderthals had less developed concepts of death and afterlife than modern humans, or might simply reflect different cultural practices, different ways of responding to death that were equally meaningful but left less archaeological evidence. Burial required community decision, required the living to decide that burying the dead was worth the effort, required coordination to accomplish the burial, required probably some form of ceremony, some words spoken or songs sung or rituals performed that marked the transition. The grave was separation, physical separation of corpse from living, but also perhaps spiritual separation, the marking of moment when the person who had been alive was now definitively dead, was now part of the past rather than the present. But burial was also connection. The grave preserved the body, kept it together rather than allowing it to scatter, marked a place where the living could return to remember, created physical location associated with the deceased. The graves were memory aids, were ways of holding onto those who had died, of keeping them present even in absence. The earliest graves are simple. Later graves would become more elaborate, would include more grave goods, would be marked with monuments, would be organized into cemeteries that became sacred landscapes. But even the earliest simple graves demonstrate something profound. Demonstrate that humans 100,000 years ago had consciousness of death that included awareness of individual identity, included emotions powerful enough that loss required ritual response, included perhaps beliefs about existence beyond death that made proper burial important. The graves held more than bones, held evidence of consciousness like ours, held testimony to love and loss and hope that are fundamentally human. The graves, the dead buried with care. The ritual attention to mortality, forever the evidence that we have always grieved, forever the testimony that we have always sought to honor the dead, forever the graves demonstrating that awareness of death and attention to the dead are ancient, are fundamental, are part of what makes us human. The graves, the burials, the care for the dead, forever. Approximately 60,000 years ago, modern humans began migrating out of Africa in significant numbers, moved into the Middle East, spread across Asia, entered Europe, reached Australia by at least 50,000 years ago, requiring sea crossings that demonstrated sophisticated seafaring. The global dispersal was unprecedented, was expansion that would eventually take humans to every continent except Antarctica, to every environment from tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra. But the humans migrating out of Africa were not entering empty lands. Were not the first humans to leave Africa. Earlier species Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis had already dispersed across the Old World hundreds of thousands of years earlier. And some of these earlier humans had evolved into distinct species adapted to particular regions. Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in Eastern Asia. Perhaps other species in other regions whose fossils have not yet been found or recognized. When modern humans began dispersing, they encountered others, met humans who were like them but not quite like them, who had evolved separately for hundreds of thousands of years, who were similar enough to interbreed but different enough to be distinct species or subspecies. The encounters between modern humans and Neanderthals are subject of endless speculation. Did they trade? Did they compete for resources? Did they fight? Did they cooperate? Did they communicate despite presumably having different languages? Did they recognize each other as fellow humans or as something other, something strange, something threatening or fascinating? We cannot know with certainty what the first meetings were like, cannot reconstruct the emotions or the interactions, cannot hear the words if words were exchanged, that passed between modern humans seeing Neanderthals for the first time and Neanderthals seeing modern humans who had just arrived in territories Neanderthals had occupied for hundreds of thousands of years. But we know the meetings happened. Know that the species overlapped in time and space for thousands of years. Know that contact occurred not as single encounter, but as ongoing interaction that lasted for millennia. The genetic evidence is unambiguous. Most people today carry Neanderthal DNA. The percentage is small, approximately 12% of the genome in non-African populations, but is real and is detectable in billions of people. The Neanderthal DNA was not acquired recently, was acquired through interbreeding that occurred tens of thousands of years ago when modern humans and Neanderthals overlapped in the Middle East and in Europe. The interbreeding was not single event, was ongoing across thousands of years. The genetic patterns suggest multiple episodes of interbreeding, multiple encounters that were intimate enough to produce offspring who survived to reproduce, to pass Neanderthal genes forward through generations until they reached us. The interbreeding testifies to relationships. Cannot determine whether relationships were consensual or coerced, whether they were marriages or assaults, whether they were love or violence, but testifies that intimacy occurred. That modern humans and Neanderthals were close enough psychologically, socially, physically that mating was possible. The same story holds for Denisovans, the species known primarily from DNA rather than from abundant fossils, known from handful of bone fragments found in Denisova Cave in Siberia. But the DNA tells remarkable story. Tells that Denisovans existed across wide range in Asia. Tells that they interbred with modern humans. Tells that some modern populations, particularly in Melanesia and Australia, carry substantial Denisovan DNA, some individuals having up to 5% of their genome from Denisovan ancestors. Tells that the meeting between modern humans and Denisovans occurred in Asia, that offspring survived, that genetic legacy persists. The Denisovan genes contribute to modern human adaptation. To high altitude, some Tibetan populations carry Denisovan gene variant that helps with oxygen processing at high elevations. The legacy is functional, is not merely historical curiosity, but is adaptation that helps people survive in challenging environments. But if modern humans interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans, why did those species go extinct while modern humans survived and flourished? The question is difficult. The genetic evidence shows interbreeding, but the species nonetheless disappeared. Neanderthals persisted until approximately 40,000 years ago, then vanished. Denisovans likewise disappeared, though exact timing is uncertain because fossils are so rare. The disappearance might have been through violence, modern humans killing or displacing other species. Might have been through competition, modern humans outcompeting others for resources, leading to population decline and eventual extinction. Might have been through interbreeding itself, small populations of Neanderthals and Denisovans being absorbed into larger modern human populations, with distinct species disappearing not through death, but through genetic mixing, until they were no longer separate. Might have been through disease, modern humans carrying pathogens to which they had some resistance, but to which Neanderthals and Denisovans had none. Likely was combination of factors, with different regions experiencing different processes. The archaeological evidence provides some clues but no definitive answers. shows that Neanderthals and modern humans occupied same regions at same times, shows that both species made tools, used fire, buried their dead, shows that Neanderthals sometimes adopted technologies that modern humans introduced: better stone tools, new hunting techniques, perhaps symbolic ornaments. The borrowing suggests contact, suggests that Neanderthals observed modern humans and learned from them. But borrowing does not tell us whether contact was friendly or hostile, does not tell us whether learning was through teaching or through simply observing and copying. The archaeological evidence shows proximity, shows overlap, shows interaction, but cannot reveal the quality of that interaction, cannot show us what individuals thought or felt when encountering others who were like them but not them. The last Neanderthals lived in refugia in isolated regions where they persisted even after disappearing from most of their range. In Gibraltar, in the Caucasus, in pockets where they held on while modern humans spread elsewhere. The extinction was gradual, was not single catastrophic event, but was slow decline, population by population, region by region, until finally the last Neanderthal died and the species was gone. Except not gone entirely, not gone genetically, not gone from the DNA of billions of people who carry Neanderthal genes, and who therefore carry the genetic legacy of species that went extinct, but that lives on in diluted form in us. The meeting of minds across species boundaries, the encounters between different humanities, the interbreeding that left genetic legacy, the extinction that was not complete erasure, forever the others who were like us but not us, forever the meetings whose outcomes shaped our genomes, forever the species that disappeared but that remain in us, the meeting, the threshold, the others who are present still, forever. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans were foragers, hunted animals, gathered plants, moved with seasons and with availability of wild resources, built temporary shelters and abandoned them, lived in small bands of perhaps 25-50 individuals, rarely seeing anyone outside their own group except for occasional encounters with neighboring bands. The foraging life was demanding, but in many ways was successful adaptation. Studies of modern foragers suggest they work fewer hours for subsistence than agricultural peoples, have more leisure time, have varied diets that are often more nutritious than diets of early farmers. The foraging way of life was not primitive failure waiting to be replaced, was sophisticated adaptation that sustained humans successfully for their entire evolutionary history, until approximately 12,000 years ago. And then, in multiple places around the world at roughly the same time, something changed. People began deliberately planting seeds, began saving the largest grains from wild grasses and planting them the next year, began the slow process of transforming wild plants into domesticated crops through selection over generations, began the agricultural revolution that would change everything. The transition to agriculture is mystery in many ways. Why did it occur when it did, after hundreds of thousands of years of foraging? Why did it occur independently in multiple regions in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, in China, in Mesoamerica, in South America, in New Guinea, in Africa at roughly the same time period between 12,000 and 10,000 years ago? Was it response to climate change, the end of the Ice Age, creating more stable climate suitable for cultivation? Was it response to population pressure, human populations having grown large enough that wild resources were becoming scarce? Was it response to the extinction of megafauna, the large animals that had been hunted going extinct, forcing humans to focus more on plant resources? Was it social or religious development, desire to settle near sacred sites, to build monuments, to create permanent communities? The explanations are not mutually exclusive. Different factors may have been important in different regions, but the timing suggests something systematic was happening, something that made agriculture attractive or necessary across wide areas at roughly the same time. The first crops were grains. In the Fertile Crescent, wheat and barley. In China, rice and millet. In Mesoamerica, corn. In Africa, sorghum. The grains were selected from wild grasses. Wild wheat has seeds that shatter easily when ripe, scattering them for reproduction. Domesticated wheat has seeds that remain on the stalk, making them easier to harvest but dependent on humans for reproduction. The transformation from wild to domesticated took generations of selection, keeping seeds from plants with desirable traits, discarding seeds from plants with undesirable traits, gradually over decades and centuries, transforming the plants. The early farmers probably did not understand what they were doing, were not consciously breeding plants, were simply preferring certain plants over others, were selecting without understanding selection, were transforming plants through accumulated choices that each generation made. Agriculture enabled population growth. Cultivated fields produced more food per acre than wild plants, enabled supporting larger populations in smaller areas, enabled sedentism, permanent villages rather than temporary camps, enabled accumulation of possessions that nomadic peoples could not carry. enabled eventually the development of cities, of civilizations, of all the complex societies that have existed since the agricultural revolution. The benefits were real, but the costs were real too. Early farmers worked harder than foragers cultivating fields, weeding, harvesting, processing grain required more labor than gathering wild plants. Early farmers had worse health than foragers. Skeletal evidence shows more disease, more dental problems, shorter stature. The agricultural diet was less varied, was dependent on few staple crops, was vulnerable to crop failure that could cause famine. The settled lifestyle enabled infectious diseases to spread more easily. Diseases that were rare in small mobile foraging bands became common in larger settled populations living in close proximity to each other, and to domesticated animals. The domestication of animals occurred alongside plant domestication. Dogs were first domesticated from wolves probably 15,000 or more years ago, perhaps earlier. Sheep and goats were domesticated in the Fertile Crescent approximately 10,000 years ago. Cattle and pigs shortly after, horses in Central Asia, llamas in South America. The domesticated animals provided meat and milk, provided wool and hides, provided labor: oxen for plowing, horses for transport. But animals also brought diseases. Many of the infectious diseases that have plagued human history, smallpox, measles, influenza, originated in domesticated animals and jumped to humans. The close association between humans and animals in agricultural societies created opportunities for pathogens to move between species, created epidemic diseases that were rare or absent among foragers. Agriculture was irreversible. Once populations grew dependent on cultivated crops, returning to foraging was not feasible. The population was too large for wild resources to support. The knowledge of wild plant locations and of foraging techniques might have been lost. The landscapes might have been transformed, forests cleared for fields, wild plants replaced by domesticated crops. The commitment to agriculture was commitment that could not be undone, was threshold that once crossed prevented return. Each generation was born into agricultural society, learned farming, depended on crops, had no choice but to continue farming because abandoning it would mean starvation. The trap was subtle. Each year's decision to plant was rational, but accumulation of rational yearly decisions created dependence from which escape was impossible. The social consequences were equally profound. Foraging bands were typically egalitarian. Everyone contributed to subsistence. No one could accumulate much more than anyone else because possessions were burden for mobile peoples. Agricultural societies could accumulate surplus, could store grain, could develop hierarchies based on control of resources, could have specialists craftspeople who did not produce food, priests, rulers, could have inequality, some families accumulating more land or more animals than others, wealth passing through generations, creating classes, could have warfare over stored resources, raids to steal grain, conflicts over land. The archaeological evidence shows increasing violence after the agricultural revolution, shows fortifications appearing, shows weapons designed for human combat rather than for hunting, shows skeletal trauma from interpersonal violence becoming more common. But agriculture also enabled achievements that foragers could not accomplish. The monuments, the art, the writing, the accumulated knowledge, the technologies, all required the food surplus that agriculture provided, required the specialization that agricultural societies enabled, required the sedentary lifestyle that made investing labor in permanent structures worthwhile. Civilization, in the sense of cities and states and empires, was built on agricultural foundation, was possible only because agriculture produced surplus that could support non-farmers. The costs of agriculture were real, but so were the benefits. And the choice, to the extent it was choice, was made thousands of years ago by ancestors who could not have foreseen the full consequences, who were solving immediate problems without understanding that they were transforming human society fundamentally and irreversibly. The seeds that changed everything. The agricultural revolution, the threshold that could not be uncrossed, forever the transformation from foraging to farming, forever the irreversible commitment, forever the seeds that made civilization possible while creating problems foragers never faced. The agriculture, the revolution, the transformation, forever. With agriculture came settlement. With settlement came permanent dwellings, houses built to last years rather than seasons, structures invested with labor and resources beyond what temporary shelters required. And with permanent houses came something that nomadic peoples rarely had: the door, the deliberate barrier, the threshold that could be controlled, the boundary between inside and outside that could be opened or closed at will. The door seems simple, is among the most common human artifacts. Every house has doors, every building. We pass through them constantly without thought. But the first door, the first deliberately controlled entryway, was transformation, was creation of private space separate from public space, was claiming of interior that could be defended, that could be restricted, that could be shared with some while excluding others. The door made possible the home in the sense we understand it, made possible the household as distinct unit, made possible eventually the nuclear family as primary social organization rather than the extended band or clan. Before doors, humans lived in relatively open settlements. Forager camps had shelters, lean-tos, windbreaks, simple structures that provided some protection from weather. But the structures were typically open, did not have walls that fully enclosed space, did not have entryways that could be blocked. Privacy was minimal. The band lived together in close quarters. Everyone could see what everyone else was doing. Personal space was limited. Possessions were few what you could carry when the band moved. The open settlement reflected and reinforced social structure. The band shared resources, made decisions collectively, lived as cohesive unit rather than as collection of autonomous households. The first permanent houses appeared with the beginning of settlement, perhaps 12,000 years ago or slightly earlier. Were round structures at first, walls made of stone or mud brick or wood, roofs thatched with plant materials. The structures were small single-room, perhaps 34 meters in diameter, barely large enough for family to sleep. But they were permanent, were built to last, were invested with labor that made sense only if people planned to stay. And they had doors, had entryways that could be closed with woven mats or wooden planks or hide curtains. The closures were not secure, could not resist determined intrusion, but sent message, marked boundary, declared that the space inside was not public space where anyone could enter freely, was private space that belonged to the household. The door created new social dynamics, created possibility of excluding others, of saying you cannot enter, of controlling who had access to the space and to the possessions stored there. The door enabled the accumulation of property in ways that open settlements made difficult. If your possessions could be secured behind door, you could accumulate more, could store grain, could keep tools and implements, could have valuables that were worth protecting. The door made hoarding possible, made inequality possible in ways that open settlements discouraged. In foraging bands, everyone could see what everyone else had. Hoarding was difficult. Social pressure encouraged sharing. But behind closed doors, accumulation could be hidden, could be defended, could become basis for wealth that some had and others lacked. But the door also created protection, created space where household could be safe from intrusion, could rest without constant vigilance, could have privacy that open settlements did not allow. The door meant that what happened inside the house was household's business, created domestic sphere separate from public sphere, created possibility of family life as distinct from community life. The separation had costs and benefits, enabled autonomy, enabled households to make decisions without requiring community consensus, but also isolated households from each other, reduced the collective decision-making that characterized foraging bands, shifted the primary social unit from the band to the household, changed social relationships in ways that were subtle but profound. The symbolism of the door was rich. The threshold was liminal space, neither inside nor outside, neither private nor public, neither home nor world. Crossing threshold was transition, was moving between states, was entering protected space or leaving it. Many cultures developed rituals around thresholds, blessings of doorways, ceremonies for carrying brides over thresholds, taboos about who could cross and when. The door became marker of identity. The household was defined by who could pass through the door freely and who could not. Family members could enter, others needed permission. The door marked belonging, marked insiders and outsiders. The evolution of doors reflected social evolution. The earliest doors were simple closures. Later doors became more elaborate, developed locks, developed decorations that announced the household's status, developed symbolic meanings. The door became not just functional barrier, but became statement about who lived inside, about their wealth and power and identity. The great doors of temples and palaces were statements of power, were announcing that what lay behind them was important, was valuable, was protected. The humble doors of peasant houses were statements of humility, were acknowledging lower status. But even humble doors claimed some privacy. Even simple barriers created separation between inside and outside. The door that closed created the inside, created the concept of home as separate from world, created domestic space where different rules applied, where the household could be itself without public scrutiny, where children could be raised according to the household's values, where possessions could be accumulated and protected, where privacy was possible. But the door also created exclusion, created the locked door, created the refusal of entry, created the homeless, those who had no door to close, no inside to retreat to, created the burglar, the one who broke through doors, who violated the boundary, who entered uninvited, created the threshold that divided those who belonged from those who didn't, the first door closing, the creation of inside and outside, the privacy and exclusion together, forever the barrier that protected and divided, forever the threshold controlled, forever the door marking the boundary between domestic and public. The door, the threshold, the closing, forever. In ancient Mesopotamia, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers where agriculture had flourished for thousands of years, where cities had emerged, where complex societies required administration beyond what memory alone could manage, someone pressed marks into wet clay. Simple marks at first, marks that represented quantities. A mark for 1 jar of oil, a mark for 10 sheep, a mark for a unit of grain. The marks were not pictures of the things they represented, were abstract symbols, were agreed-upon signs that meant something to those who understood the system. The marks were memory aids, were records that did not require remembering, were externalization of information that previously had to be held in mind. The marks were the beginning of writing. The earliest marks were purely numerical and administrative, were ways of recording transactions, of tracking goods entering and leaving storehouses, of accounting for tributes paid to temples or to rulers. The system was sufficient for basic administration, but the system evolved. The marks became more elaborate, developed signs for not just quantities but for the items themselves. A sign for sheep, a sign for grain, a sign for silver. The pictographic signs were still not writing in full sense, could record what and how much but not who or when or why, could not record speech, could not capture language, were notation system rather than true writing. The transformation to true writing occurred gradually. The pictographic signs became stylized, became cuneiform wedge-shaped impressions made by pressing reed stylus into clay at different angles. The cuneiform signs lost their pictographic quality, became abstract shapes that had to be learned. The signs developed phonetic values, could represent sounds as well as objects, could be combined to spell names and words that had no pictographic representation, could record speech, could capture language in visible form, could make words permanent. The transformation was complete by approximately 3200 BC. Writing had been invented. Speech could be preserved beyond the moment of speaking. Thought could be transmitted across space and time without requiring living teacher or speaker. The consequences were enormous. Writing enabled administration of complex societies, enabled keeping records that extended beyond human lifespan, enabled laws to be written down, making them fixed rather than subject to memory's variations, enabled contracts that could be verified, enabled correspondence that could travel distances, enabled the accumulation of knowledge across generations. What one generation learned could be written down for future generations to read, could be built upon rather than being lost when the knowledgeable died. Writing enabled history events could be recorded, could be preserved, could be studied by those who had not experienced them. Writing enabled literature stories and poems that had existed in oral tradition could be fixed in text, could be reproduced, could be preserved across millennia. But writing also created inequalities. Literacy required training, required years of practice to learn the complex cuneiform system with hundreds of signs. Most people could not read or write. Literacy was restricted to scribes, professional writers who learned the system through long apprenticeship, who worked for temples and palaces and wealthy merchants, who held power through their monopoly on literacy. The literate could create records, could write contracts that illiterate could not verify, could read documents that others could not access, could participate in administration that required literacy. The divide between literate and illiterate became social divide, became basis for hierarchy, became way that power was concentrated among those who had access to writing. The content of earliest texts is revealing. Most are administrative lists of goods, records of transactions, receipts, and inventories. The texts are mundane, are the bureaucratic necessities of running complex societies. But among the administrative texts are others. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving work of literature, composed in cuneiform on clay tablets, telling story of legendary king and his quest for immortality. The text is profound, explores themes of friendship and mortality and the human condition, shows that writing was used not just for administration, but for preserving stories, for creating literature, for expressing ideas and emotions that were not strictly necessary for managing grain stores or collecting tributes. Writing enabled new forms of expression, enabled authors, enabled texts that could be studied and interpreted and appreciated across generations. But writing also displaced oral tradition. The flexibility of oral narrative, the ability to adapt stories to audiences, to emphasize different themes, to incorporate new elements was lost when stories were fixed in text. The communal nature of oral storytelling, the interaction between teller and listeners, the participation of audience in performance was reduced when story became text that individual read silently. The memory skills that oral cultures developed, the ability to memorize vast amounts of information, to preserve knowledge without writing, became less necessary and therefore less practiced. Writing was more reliable than memory, but reliability came at cost of adaptability. The clay tablets that held cuneiform texts were durable, could last for millennia if baked or if buried where moisture and temperature were stable. The durability meant that we can read texts from thousands of years ago, can hear voices of ancient scribes, can access their records and stories and knowledge. The clay remembered speech, preserved it across time in ways that oral tradition could not. But the clay also represents transition from oral to literate, from memory to text, from fluid narrative to fixed document. The transition brought gains and losses, enabled things that oral culture could not achieve, but displaced things that literate culture struggles to maintain. The marks on clay that began as simple tallies, that evolved into complex writing system, that preserved speech and enabled history and made possible the transmission of knowledge across millennia. The clay that remembered, the writing that changed everything, the externalization of memory and speech, forever the marks carrying meaning, forever the clay holding voices of the dead, forever the threshold between oral and literate, the writing, the clay, the remembering, forever. As settlements grew into towns and towns into cities, as agriculture enabled population growth, as specialization meant that communities produced different goods and needed to trade the spaces between settlements became important. The footpaths between villages became roads. Simple at first beaten earth where many feet had walked, following terrain's easiest routes, avoiding obstacles. But the roads gradually improved, were maintained, were widened, were sometimes paved, became infrastructure that enabled trade, that connected communities, that made possible the exchange of goods and ideas across distances that would have kept communities isolated without the roads to link them. The earliest roads of which we have clear evidence date to Bronze Age, roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. The roads in Mesopotamia, the roads in Egypt, the roads in Indus Valley. The roads were not merely footpaths but were engineered, were built deliberately, were maintained by authorities, were designed to facilitate transport. Some roads were paved with stones. Some had drainage systems to prevent flooding. Some had mile markers to indicate distances. The construction of roads required organization. Someone had to decide where roads should go, had to mobilize labor to build them, had to maintain them over time. The roads were public works, were investments that rulers made to facilitate administration, to enable armies to move, to encourage trade that could be taxed. The roads enabled trade networks. Copper and tin, the metals necessary for bronze, rarely occurred in the same locations. Communities that had copper needed tin. Communities that had tin needed copper. The trade in metals required transportation over sometimes hundreds of miles, required roads that carts could travel, that merchants could use safely, that connected production centers to consumption centers. The roads carried not just metals, but many goods, textiles and pottery and food and luxury items. The trade enriched all participants, enabled specialization. Communities could focus on producing what they were best at and could trade for what they lacked. Enabled innovation. Ideas and techniques could spread along trade routes, could be adopted and adapted by communities that learned of them through contact with traders. But roads also enabled armies, enabled rapid movement of troops, enabled projection of power over distances. The empires that emerged in ancient world depended on roads. The Persian Empire built roads connecting its far-flung territories. The Roman Empire's roads were famous paved highways that connected Rome to provinces across Europe and North Africa and the Middle East. The roads enabled Roman legions to move quickly to suppress rebellions, to defend frontiers, to conquer new territories. The roads were military infrastructure as much as they were commercial infrastructure, were tools of power as well as tools of trade. The roads also enabled the spread of disease. In isolated communities, epidemics burned out, infected everyone susceptible, killed some, left survivors immune, then had no new hosts and disappeared. But connected communities could pass diseases back and forth, could reintroduce diseases after susceptible population had grown again, could enable diseases to spread along trade routes, jumping from community to community, creating epidemics that spread across entire regions. The plague of Justinian in 6th century AD, one of the first well-documented pandemics spread along trade routes, killed millions across the Mediterranean world. The Black Death in 14th century AD likewise spread along trade routes from Asia to Europe. The connection that roads enabled had costs as well as benefits. The roads changed the scale of human interaction. Before roads, most people never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace, knew only their own community and perhaps a few neighboring communities. The world was small, was local, was limited to what could be reached on foot. Roads expanded the world, enabled travel over greater distances, enabled migration, enabled pilgrimage to distant sacred sites, enabled students to travel to study with distant teachers, enabled merchants to trade across regions, enabled the circulation of people and goods and ideas that was not possible when communities were isolated. The roads also created boundaries. The communities connected by roads were network, but those outside the network were excluded, were isolated not just by distance but by lack of access to infrastructure. The roads privileged some communities over others. The cities on major trade routes prospered. The villages far from roads remained poor. The inequality was partly result of geography. Some locations were naturally more central, more connected. But inequality was also result of investment. Roads were built where rulers and merchants saw benefit, were not built where no one powerful cared. The networks that roads created included some while excluding others. The famous ancient roads, the Silk Road connecting China to the Mediterranean, the Amber Road bringing Baltic amber south, the incense route carrying frankincense and myrrh from Arabia were not single roads but were networks, were routes that changed over time, that had multiple branches, that connected through numerous intermediate cities and peoples. The Silk Road was not built by single empire, was accidental network that emerged as traders carried goods from caravan to caravan, from city to city, gradually connecting east and west without any central plan or control. The network enabled exchange across vast distances, enabled silk from China to reach Rome, enabled glassware from Mediterranean to reach China, enabled ideas to travel, Buddhism spreading from India to China along the Silk Road, artistic styles influencing regions thousands of miles apart. But the romantic image of ancient trade routes obscures the reality. Most traders traveled only short distances, carried goods from one city to the next, sold them to merchants who carried them farther. The goods changed hands many times before reaching final destination. Few, if any, individuals traveled the entire length of routes. The networks were fragmented, were collections of local connections that accumulated into long-distance routes. The romance was real, the goods did travel, the ideas did spread, the connections did exist. But the reality was more mundane, was countless traders making local journeys, was accumulated effect of many small connections creating larger network. The roads that connected isolated communities, the networks that enabled trade and that spread diseases, the infrastructure that empires built and maintained, the routes that changed the scale of human interaction, the boundaries between those connected and those excluded, forever the paths becoming roads, forever the roads creating networks, forever the connections transforming human societies from isolated communities to trading partners and competitors and eventual empires. the roads, the networks, the connections, forever. At some threshold in human development at a moment we cannot precisely locate, through a process we can only partially reconstruct an individual achieved self-awareness. Looked into still water or polished metal or some other reflective surface, and recognized the image looking back. Understood, that is me. Saw self as object that could be observed, as entity separate from the world even while being part of it. As I who could contemplate myself and could wonder about the nature of that contemplation. The moment, if it was moment rather than gradual emergence, was transformation as profound as language or fire, was the creation of the examined life, was the beginning of philosophy and psychology and all the disciplines that study consciousness, was the emergence of the distinctive human capacity for reflection, for thinking about thinking, for awareness of awareness. Self-awareness is different from consciousness. Many animals are conscious, experience sensations, respond to environment, feel emotions. But self-awareness is consciousness that reflects on itself, is knowing that you know, is experiencing and simultaneously observing the experience, is the recursive loop that creates the sense of being a subject who perceives the world rather than being merely part of the world's processes. The difference is subtle but profound. Consciousness without self-awareness is experiencing without reflecting, is living in the present without conceptualizing past or future selves, is responding without understanding that you are the one responding. The evidence for when self-awareness emerged is indirect. We cannot observe prehistoric consciousness directly, must infer mental states from behavior and from artifacts. The art suggests self-awareness creating images, requires envisioning the result, requires planning, requires thinking about future self who will view the completed work. The burials suggest self-awareness, caring for the dead suggests awareness of individual identity that persists in memory after death, suggests recognition that the dead were once selves like living selves. The complex tools suggest self-awareness planning across multiple steps, suggests imagining future self using the completed tool. But all these inferences are uncertain, could potentially be explained without requiring full self-awareness. The threshold between consciousness and self-awareness is difficult to identify in archaeological record. Some animals pass the mirror test. The test is simple place mark on animal's body where animal cannot see it without mirror. Put animal in front of mirror. Observe whether animal tries to touch or remove the mark from own body rather than from mirror image. The response of touching own body rather than mirror image suggests animal recognizes reflection as self. Some great apes pass the test. Some dolphins, some elephants, possibly some birds. The test has limitations. Failing the test does not prove absence of self-awareness, might simply mean animal is not interested in marks or in mirrors. But passing the test strongly suggests at least rudimentary self-awareness, suggests ability to recognize self in reflection. The question of whether Neanderthals had self-awareness is unanswerable but haunting. They buried their dead. They created some forms of symbolism. They had large brains. They likely had language or proto-language. Did they have the recursive consciousness that recognizes itself? Did they wonder about their own nature? Did they contemplate mortality? Did they ask why? We cannot know. The question matters for whether self-awareness is ancient, shared with Neanderthals, and therefore dating back at least 500,000 years to common ancestor, or is recent development specific to modern humans. Matters for whether self-awareness is universal human trait or is learned cultural behavior. Matters for understanding what it means to be human. Self-awareness enables mental time travel, enables remembering past as past, not just accessing memories, but recognizing that memories are about earlier self, about experiences that happened to me. Enables imagining future as future, not just planning actions, but envisioning future self who will experience the consequences of current choices. The sense of continuous identity across time depends on self-awareness. Without it, the being who remembers would not connect past self to present self, would not understand the memories as belonging to continuous identity. With it, we understand ourselves as persisting through time, as having history and as moving toward future. Self-awareness enables moral reasoning, enables asking whether actions are right or wrong, enables imagining how actions affect others, enables guilt and shame emotions that require recognizing that self has violated standards, enables pride and satisfaction emotions that require recognizing that self has achieved something valued. The moral sense that is distinctively human may depend on self-awareness. Without ability to reflect on own actions, to judge self by standards, to experience emotions that arise from self-evaluation, morality might be limited to immediate emotional responses rather than extending to reasoned ethical judgments. But self-awareness also creates suffering, creates awareness of own mortality, creates anxiety about future, creates regret about past, creates the examined life that Socrates claimed was worth living, but that also creates burdens that unreflective consciousness does not bear. Animals without self-awareness do not fear death in the same way, do not worry about futures that have not arrived, do not torment themselves with memories of past failures. The recursive consciousness that recognizes itself is blessing and curse together, enables achievements but creates pains. The gift of self-awareness is ambiguous gift. The mirror reflecting me, the recognition of self, the awareness of awareness, the threshold that created the examined life, the recursive loop of consciousness reflecting on itself. Forever the moment, whether gradual or sudden, when human became not just conscious but self-conscious, not just aware but aware of awareness, not just experiencing but observing experience. Forever the transformation that created the sense of I that persists through time, that asks questions about itself, that contemplates its own nature. Forever the mirror that enabled seeing self as self rather than simply being self. The mirror, the reflection, the me that looks back. Forever the threshold of self-awareness. Forever the examined life beginning. Forever.